To understand the Great Pyramid of Giza, we must first travel back in time, long before the first limestone block was ever quarried. We must begin with the environment that shaped the ancient Egyptian mind, the river and the desert. The Nile River was the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. Every year, predictable as clockwork, the river flooded its banks in a season the Egyptians called Akhet, the inundation. This annual flood deposited a thick layer of black, nutrient-rich silt across the valley, transforming the arid landscape into a fertile oasis. This stark contrast between the black, life-giving soil of the river valley, known as Kemet, and the red, lifeless sands of the surrounding desert, known as Deshret, created a worldview centered entirely on duality, balance, and cycles. To the ancient Egyptians, life was not a linear journey with a final end, but a continuous loop mirroring the daily setting and rising of the sun and the annual flooding and receding of the Nile. Death was merely a transition, a journey from the physical world into the afterlife, known as the Field of Reeds. However, this eternal life was not guaranteed. It required absolute preservation of the physical body and a secure home for the spirit. The Egyptian soul was complex, divided into several parts. The two most critical for the afterlife were the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was the life force, a spiritual double that required sustenance, food, and drink offerings, even after death. The Ba was the personality or essence of the individual, often depicted as a bird with a human head, which could travel between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. For the Ka and the Ba to survive and reunite, the physical body had to remain intact as an anchor. If the body was destroyed, the soul would cease to exist, a fate worse than death itself, absolute oblivion. This profound fear of oblivion drove the architectural evolution of the Egyptian tomb. In the pre-dynastic period, before the unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE, burials were simple. The deceased were placed in shallow, oval pit graves dug directly into the desert sand on the edges of the Nile Valley, safely away from the floodwaters. They were buried in a fetal position, facing west toward the setting sun, accompanied by a few modest grave goods like pottery and flint tools. The hot, dry desert sand acted as a natural desiccant. It rapidly absorbed the moisture from the corpse, preventing bacterial decay and naturally mummifying the body. These early pit graves accidentally achieved the exact physical preservation the Egyptian religion demanded. But as Egyptian society grew more complex and wealthy, this simple burial method presented a problem. Jackals and wild dogs roamed the desert at night, frequently digging up the shallow graves to scavenge. Furthermore, the wind constantly shifted the sands, sometimes exposing the bodies to the elements. For the emerging elite class, a pit in the sand was no longer sufficient. They demanded protection, permanence, and a monument that reflected their status. The solution was the mastaba. The word mastaba comes from the Arabic word for bench, because when early archaeologists viewed these structures from a distance, they resembled the flat, mud brick benches found outside traditional Egyptian homes. A mastaba was a massive, rectangular structure with a flat roof and walls that sloped slightly inward. It was built directly over the burial pit, effectively sealing it off from scavengers and the elements. The earliest mastabas, constructed during the First Dynasty, were made entirely of sun-dried mud brick. Workers would gather the dark alluvial mud from the banks of the Nile, mix it with water, sand, and straw for structural integrity, press it into wooden molds, and leave it to bake in the relentless Egyptian sun. The transition to the mastaba fundamentally changed the burial process, and in doing so, created an unintended consequence that would push Egyptian engineering to its limits. By placing a heavy mud brick structure over the grave, the body was no longer in direct contact with the hot, dry desert sand. Without the sand to naturally draw out the moisture, the bodies inside the mastabas began to decompose rapidly. To solve this, the Egyptians had to invent artificial mummification. They began to remove the internal organs, which decay fastest, and packed the body with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound harvested from dry lake beds near the Nile Delta. Natron acted like a sponge, completely drying out the flesh over a period of 70 days. The body was then wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, soaked in resin, and placed in a wooden coffin. The mastaba was not just a protective shell, It was a complex machine designed to sustain the soul. The structure was divided into two distinct parts, the subterranean burial chamber and the above-ground superstructure. The burial chamber was carved deep into the bedrock beneath the earth. It housed the mummified body, a sarcophagus, and a vast array of grave goods, furniture, weapons, jewelry, and vast stores of food and wine. This chamber was accessed via a deep vertical shaft. Once the burial rites were complete, this shaft was filled with rubble and sand and sealed off entirely to protect the deceased from grave robbers. Above ground, the mastaba featured an offering chapel accessible to the family and priests. The focal point of this chapel was the false door. This was a solid architectural feature, carved to look like a real door, but impassable to the living. The Egyptians believed the false door was a magical threshold. The ba of the deceased could pass through the solid stone of the false door to enter the chapel, consume the spiritual essence of the food and drink left by the priests, and then return to the burial chamber below. Hidden deep within the thick mud brick walls of the mastaba was another crucial room called the serdab. The serdab was completely sealed off, save for a small slit or eye hole cut through the masonry into the offering chapel. Inside the serdab sat a life-sized statue of the deceased. If the mummy in the subterranean chamber was ever destroyed by time or thieves, this statue served as a backup vessel for the Ka. Through the small slit in the wall, the statue could breathe the incense and observe the offerings being made in the chapel. For hundreds of years, throughout the first and second dynasties, the mastaba remained the standard tomb for the pharaohs and the high nobility. With each generation, they grew larger and more elaborate. Some featured multiple rooms, exterior niches painted in vibrant geometric patterns, and massive perimeter walls. But mud brick, no matter how well baked, is entirely vulnerable to time and weather. Wind erosion and the occasional torrential rainstorm slowly melted these early monuments back into the earth. The pharaohs, believing themselves to be living gods destined to rule for eternity, required a building material that was just as immortal. The turning point in human engineering arrived during the Third Dynasty around 2670 BCE with the reign of a pharaoh named Djoser and the genius of a man who would eventually be deified for his architectural vision, Imhotep. Imhotep was a figure of such profound intellect and capability that 2,000 years after his death, the Egyptians would elevate him to the status of a god. He was the vizier to Pharaoh Djoser, the high priest of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis, a physician, an astronomer, and above all, the first named architect in recorded human history. When Djoser ascended to the throne, he tasked Imhotep with constructing his eternal resting place on the desert plateau of Saqqara, a necropolis that overlooked the teeming capital city of Memphis. Imhotep understood the fundamental flaw of the traditional mud brick mastaba. Mud was a material of the earth, subject to erosion, decay, and the relentless grinding of the desert wind. A living god required a dwelling made of something eternal. Imhotep looked past the mud of the riverbanks and turned his attention to the bedrock itself. He decided to build Djoser's tomb entirely out of dressed stone. This decision cannot be overstated. It was an architectural leap equivalent to the invention of the wheel. Before Imhotep, stone had only been used sparingly in Egyptian construction, perhaps for a door lintel or a small paved floor. No one had ever attempted to construct an entire monumental building from quarried limestone. The logistical challenges were immediate and staggering. The Egyptians of the Third Dynasty did not have iron or steel. Their tools were made of copper, a relatively soft metal. To cut the limestone, workers had to rely on copper chisels, wooden mallets, and heavy, rounded pounding stones made of dolerite, one of the hardest rocks on earth. They used a slurry of water and quartz sand as an abrasive to saw through the stone blocks. It was a process of sheer, grinding attrition, requiring immense patience and thousands of laborers. The construction at Saqqara began not as a pyramid, but as a traditional mastaba. Imhotep's first design was a massive, square, flat-roofed structure, roughly 26 feet high, built entirely of limestone blocks. Even if he had stopped there, this stone mastaba would have been the most impressive structure in Egypt. But Imhotep was observing the monument as it rose, and he realized a critical visual problem. The Saqqara Plateau was vast and flat. A 26-foot high flat-roofed building, while massive up close, simply disappeared into the horizon when viewed from the capital city of Memphis below. Furthermore, the high enclosure wall that Imhotep was building around the complex completely obscured the mastaba from the outside. Djoser's tomb was meant to be a beacon of divine power, but it was practically invisible. To solve this, Imhotep ordered the builders to expand the base of the mastaba and build a second, slightly smaller mastaba directly on top of it. He then expanded it again, adding a third tier. Finally, the design was radically revised one last time, extending the structure outward and upward until it consisted of 6 distinct decreasing tiers. The result was the step pyramid. It rose 204 feet, or 62 meters, into the desert sky. It was clad in blindingly white limestone brought from the Tura quarries on the opposite side of the Nile. When the sun struck it, the pyramid would have gleamed like a polished jewel visible from miles away. This verticality was not merely an aesthetic choice. It represented a profound theological shift. The traditional mastaba was tied to the earth and the underworld, reflecting the domain of Osiris, the god of the dead. But the step pyramid reached upward. It was a physical manifestation of the sun cult of Ra. The 6 steps were designed as a colossal, literal stairway for the pharaoh's soul to ascend into the heavens and join the sun god in his daily journey across the sky. While the step pyramid itself was the centerpiece, it was only a fraction of the total engineering project. Imhotep enclosed an area of 40 acres within a massive limestone wall that stood 34 feet high and stretched for over a mile in perimeter. This wall was intricately carved with recessed panels, designed to perfectly mimic the facade of Djoser's earthly palace in Memphis. It featured 14 distinct gateways, but 13 of them were false doors, carved into the solid stone. Only one narrow entrance, tucked away in the southeast corner, allowed the living to pass through. Inside this massive enclosure, Imhotep constructed a sprawling courtyard meant to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. The most important feature was the Hebsed court. The Hebsed was a grueling physical jubilee festival that a pharaoh was expected to perform after 30 years of rule to prove he still possessed the vitality to govern Egypt. The pharaoh had to run a prescribed course between territorial markers, demonstrating his physical dominance over the unified lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. Because Djoser would need to rule for eternity in the afterlife, Imhotep built a permanent stone Hebsed court for the pharaoh's spirit to use. The pavilions and shrines lining this courtyard were architectural phantoms. They looked like functional buildings from the outside, complete with carved stone doors depicted in an open position and stone columns shaped like bundled papyrus reeds. But these buildings had no interiors. They were solid masses of stone rubble, disguised by finely dressed facades. They were dummy buildings, useless to the living, but perfectly functional for a spirit traversing the afterlife. Beneath the blinding white weight of the pyramid lay a subterranean world of staggering complexity. Unlike the later pyramids at Giza, which feature relatively straightforward internal chambers, the substructure of the step pyramid is a chaotic 3-mile-long labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and galleries carved directly into the bedrock. At the bottom of a central shaft, 90 feet below ground level, rested the burial chamber. To ensure Djoser's remains were never disturbed, the chamber was constructed entirely of pink granite, a brutally hard stone transported by river barge from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. After the pharaoh was laid to rest, the chamber was sealed with a single cylindrical granite plug weighing 3.5 tons, dropped into place from a holding room above. Branching off from this central shaft were the pharaoh's spiritual apartments. Here, the raw limestone walls were decorated with tens of thousands of vibrant blue faience tiles. These small, glazed ceramic tiles were individually pinned into the walls to perfectly mimic the hanging woven reed mats that decorated Djoser's living palace. Walking through these dark, subterranean corridors, illuminated only by the flickering light of oil lamps, the walls would have shimmered with a brilliant, aquatic blue. Imhotep's masterpiece at Saqqara changed Egypt forever. He proved that stone could be mastered, shaped, and stacked to pierce the sky. But perhaps his greatest achievement was not the building itself, but the organization required to build it. Constructing the step pyramid required mobilizing thousands of quarrymen, masons, sailors, and laborers, supported by a vast network of scribes and agricultural workers to feed them. Imhotep essentially invented the state apparatus necessary for monumental public works. He established the blueprint. The mastery of stone had been achieved, and the concept of the pyramid was born. But the step pyramid was exactly that, stepped. The next generation of pharaohs would look at Djoser's monument and ask a new question. How do we fill in the steps? How do we build a true, smooth-sided pyramid? That monumental challenge would fall to a pharaoh named Sneferu, and his obsessive, trial-and-error quest would nearly bankrupt the nation before culminating in the greatest engineering era of the ancient world. The mastery of stone at Saqqara was an unprecedented triumph, but the step pyramid left a lingering theological dissatisfaction. As the Old Kingdom progressed into the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BCE, the solar cult of the god Ra grew in absolute supremacy. The pharaoh was no longer just a ruler, he was the living son of the sun god. The stepped design, symbolizing a staircase to the stars, began to fall out of favor. The priests and architects desired a new shape, one that perfectly mimicked the angled rays of the sun breaking through the clouds, descending from the heavens to strike the earth. They wanted a true, smooth-sided pyramid. The man who would bridge this architectural gap and in the process become the most prolific builder in human history was Pharaoh Sneferu. Djoser may have built the first pyramid, and Khufu would eventually build the largest, but Sneferu built 3 massive pyramids, moving more stone and perfecting the engineering techniques that made the Great Pyramid of Giza possible. His reign was defined by an obsessive, trial-and-error quest for geometric perfection, a quest that nearly bankrupted the Egyptian economy and pushed his engineers to the absolute limits of structural physics. Sneferu's first major project was located at Medum, roughly 30 miles south of Saqqara. He inherited a project likely begun by his predecessor, Huni, which started as a traditional step pyramid. But Sneferu's vision was radical. He ordered his architects to fill in the massive steps with local limestone and encase the entire structure in a smooth, continuous outer layer of fine white Tura limestone. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The builders at Medum did not fundamentally change the internal engineering to support the new smooth sides. They built the outer casing blocks, resting directly on the flat sand of the desert floor, rather than anchoring them firmly into the bedrock. Furthermore, the inner layers of the step pyramid had been polished smooth before the outer casing was applied. The result was a massive lack of friction. As millions of tons of stone were stacked higher and higher, the outward and downward pressure became unbearable. While archaeologists debate the exact timeline, it is widely believed that the Medum pyramid suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The sheer weight of the added casing, combined with the lack of bedrock foundation and the smooth inner walls, caused the outer layers to simply slide off. With a deafening roar, millions of tons of white limestone avalanched onto the desert floor, leaving only the steep, 3-tiered inner core standing amidst a sea of rubble. If this collapse happened during Sneferu's reign, it was a colossal embarrassment and a terrifying omen. But Sneferu did not stop. He simply relocated his efforts further north to the plateau of Dashur, armed with the harsh lessons learned at Medum. At Dashur, Sneferu's architects began construction on what we now call the Bent Pyramid. From the very first block, this monument was designed to be a true, smooth-sided pyramid. To prevent the slipping that doomed Medum, the engineers laid the foundation blocks directly onto solid bedrock, cutting them at an inward angle. This meant the entire weight of the pyramid would push inward toward the center, rather than outward toward the edge. They also tackled the problem of the burial chamber. In the step pyramid, the burial chamber was carved deep underground, but for the bent pyramid, Sneferu's architects wanted to place the chamber inside the actual body of the pyramid itself. This presented a terrifying physical problem. If you hollow out a room inside a mountain of stone, the millions of tons of rock directly above that room will crash down and crush it. To solve this, they invented the corbelled vault. Instead of a flat ceiling, the engineers laid each successive course of stone in the ceiling, slightly projecting inward over the layer below it, like a reverse staircase. They continued this staggering inward until the gap was small enough to be capped by a single block. This ingenious design took the massive downward pressure of the pyramid and redirected it outward, safely distributing the weight around the chamber rather than directly onto it. The bent pyramid rose at a steep, ambitious angle of 54 degrees, but as the monument reached roughly 150 feet in height, the engineers noticed something terrifying. The ground beneath the pyramid, which was composed of softer clay rather than solid limestone bedrock, began to subside under the unimaginable weight. Deep cracks started to appear in the internal chambers. The pyramid was tearing itself apart from the inside. Panic must have set in. To save the structure, the engineers drastically reduced reduced the steepness of the incline. Halfway up the monument, they suddenly changed the angle from 54 degrees to a much shallower 43 degrees. This emergency alteration gave the pyramid its unique, highly recognizable bent shape. The bent pyramid survived, but it was flawed. It was structurally compromised and visually imperfect. For a living god, a broken pyramid was unacceptable. And so, with an aging pharaoh and time running out, Sneferu ordered the construction of a third and final pyramid, located just 1 mile north of the bent pyramid. This was the Red Pyramid, named for the iron-rich, reddish limestone used for its core blocks. This time, there would be no mistakes, no compromises, and no steep, ambitious angles. The architects started from the very beginning with the safe, shallow angle of 43 degrees, the exact angle that had saved the top half of the bent pyramid. They laid massive, perfectly leveled foundations on solid bedrock. They utilized the core belt vaulting perfectly, creating 3 magnificent, towering chambers deep inside the structure. The logistics required for this third attempt were staggering. To supply the timber needed for the massive wooden sleds, rollers, and scaffolding, Sneferu had to establish international trade routes. He sent a fleet of 40 massive ships across the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Byblos in modern-day Lebanon, strictly to harvest the massive cedar trees that did not grow in Egypt. The state was completely reorganized around this singular architectural goal. Sneferu created massive royal estates in the fertile delta, agricultural centers whose sole purpose was to produce the grain, beer, and cattle needed to feed the tens of thousands of laborers working at Dashur. This was not slave labor, as popular myth suggests. This was a highly organized, deeply motivated workforce of skilled craftsmen and conscripted farmers working during the flood season when their fields were underwater. Finally, after decades of failure, cracking stone, and relentless labor, the Red Pyramid was completed. It was a perfect, smooth-sided geometric marvel, rising 341 feet into the sky. It was the first successful true pyramid in human history. Sneferu had conquered the physics of stone. He had established the complex logistical supply chains, the international trade routes, and the agricultural surplus required to sustain a multi-decade mega-project. He died leaving behind a unified, fiercely efficient nation and a blueprint for absolute architectural perfection. The stage was finally set. The mathematical and engineering groundwork was complete. The throne passed to Sneferu's son, Khufu, who would take these hard-won lessons and move to a rocky plateau known as Giza to build a monument that would outlast time itself. When Pharaoh Khufu ascended to the throne around 2589 BCE, he inherited an empire at the absolute peak of its economic and organizational power. His father, Sneferu, had conquered the physics of pyramid building and established the vast supply chains necessary to move mountains. Khufu did not need to invent the true pyramid. His task was to scale it to a size that defied human comprehension. He would build the Great Pyramid, a structure so massive that it would remain the tallest artificial structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. To achieve this, Khufu needed a new canvas. The plateau at Dashur, where his father had built, rested on unstable clay. For the sheer mass Khufu envisioned, he required a foundation of solid, unyielding bedrock. He found it on the Giza Plateau, a rocky limestone escarpment located directly across the river from the ancient capital of Memphis. The Great Pyramid is often marveled at for its height, which originally reached 481 feet, but the true engineering miracle lies in its base. The pyramid covers a sprawling 13 acres. If you were to walk the perimeter, you would travel more than half a mile. Yet, across this massive footprint, the foundation is leveled to within less than an inch. How did a civilization possessing only copper tools and ropes achieve such microscopic precision across 13 acres of uneven desert bedrock? The most widely accepted theory is that the Egyptian engineers used water as their leveling tool. They likely carved a grid of shallow trenches into the bedrock around the perimeter of the planned pyramid. By flooding these trenches with water from the Nile, the surface of the water created an absolutely perfect horizontal plane. The engineers could then measure down from the water's surface to the rock floor, marking exactly how much stone needed to be chipped away to make the bedrock perfectly flat. Equally astonishing is the pyramid's alignment. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned almost perfectly to the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. The alignment is accurate to to within 3/60ths of a degree of true north. They achieved this without a magnetic compass, which would not be invented in China for another 2,000 years. Instead, the Egyptian priests, who were also master astronomers, used the stars. Through a ceremony known as stretching the cord, they would observe a circumpolar star, a star that never sets but circles the celestial pole. They would mark exactly where this star rose on the eastern horizon and exactly where it set on the western horizon. By drawing a line between these 2 points and perfectly bisecting that angle, they found exact geographic true north. This line became the primary axis for the entire construction site. With the foundation leveled and aligned, the greatest logistical operation in ancient history began. The Great Pyramid is composed of an estimated 2.3 million individual blocks of stone. The average block weighs 2.5 tons, while some of the larger blocks used in the inner chambers weigh up to 70 tons. For centuries, popular culture, fueled by Greek historians like Herodotus, who visited Egypt thousands of years after the pyramids were built, promoted the myth that the pyramids were built by armies of brutally whipped slaves. Modern archaeology has completely dismantled this narrative. The Great Pyramid was not built by slaves. It was built by a highly organized, well-fed, and deeply respected workforce of Egyptian citizens. Excavations by archaeologist Mark Lenner on the Giza plateau revealed the lost city of the pyramids, a massive settlement located just south of the Sphinx. This city housed a rotating workforce of roughly 20,000 people. The excavations uncovered massive bakeries, breweries, and the bones of thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats. The workers at Giza were eating prime cuts of meat, a luxury the average Egyptian farmer rarely enjoyed. This workforce was organized with military precision into units called philes, which were further divided into working gangs of about 200 men. We know this because these gangs proudly painted their names in red ochre on the stone blocks before they were hidden deep within the pyramid. Graffiti left behind reveals names like the Friends of Khufu gang and the Drunkards of Menkaure. Building the pyramid was considered a national duty, an act of religious devotion to ensure the living God achieved immortality, which in turn guaranteed the cosmic balance of the entire nation. The logistics of moving 2.3 million blocks are staggering. The vast majority of the stone, the rough yellowish limestone that makes up the core of the pyramid, was quarried directly on the Giza plateau, just a few hundred yards from the construction site. But the outer casing of the pyramid, the layer that made it smooth and blindingly reflective, was made of fine white Tora limestone quarried on the opposite side of the Nile. These casing stones had to be loaded onto barges and floated across the river during the annual flood, when the waters reached all the way to the edge of the Giza plateau. Even more challenging was the granite. For the pharaoh's inner burial chamber, Khufu demanded walls and a sarcophagus made of red granite. The nearest source for this incredibly hard stone was the quarries at Aswan, 500 miles to the south, transporting 70-ton blocks of granite down the Nile on wooden barges and then dragging them up earthen ramps to a height of 150 feet into the heart of the pyramid, represents an orchestration of labor and physics that remains awe-inspiring today. To reduce friction, laborers dragged the heavy wooden sledges over the sand, pouring precisely measured amounts of water in front of the runners. Too much water and the sled would sink into the mud. Too little and the friction would require too many men. The exact ratio of water to sand cut the pulling force required by half. But while the exterior of the Great Pyramid is a marvel of brute force logistics, the interior is a realm of architectural anomalies and mysteries that still baffle structural engineers today. Unlike earlier pyramids, which hid their chambers deep underground, the Great Pyramid contains 3 distinct main chambers, stacked one above the other within the core of the masonry. The lowest is the subterranean chamber, carved roughly 100 feet down into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. It is a strange, claustrophobic space. It looks entirely unfinished. The ceiling is smooth, but the floor is a jagged mess of raw bedrock, and a seemingly useless tunnel extends from one wall, only to abruptly dead end into solid rock. Was this meant to be the original burial chamber, abandoned due to a change in plans, or was it deliberately left rough to serve as a symbolic representation of the chaotic underworld? Ascending into the body of the pyramid itself, we find the so-called Queen's Chamber. The name is a misnomer given by early Arab explorers. Egyptian queens were buried in their own smaller pyramids outside. The true purpose of this perfectly square, finely finished limestone room remains unknown. It contains a large, corbelled niche in one wall, which may have once held a life-sized statue of the pharaohs Ka, but the most perplexing feature of the Queen's Chamber lies hidden in its walls. In 1872, a British engineer tapping on the walls discovered two small shafts, about 8 inches square, tunneling upward through the pyramid. Strangely, these shafts were completely sealed off at both ends. They did not break through to the chamber room, nor did they exit to the outside of the pyramid. They were entirely enclosed within the stone. Why would the builders go through the excruciating effort of perfectly aligning and cutting a hollow, angled tunnel through millions of tons of stone only to seal it off entirely? Leaving the Queen's Chamber, you enter what is arguably the most breathtaking interior space in the ancient world, the Grand Gallery. This is a massive, sloping corridor, 153 feet long and 26 feet high. To prevent the ceiling from collapsing under the weight of the pyramid above, the walls are corbelled, stepping inward in 7 distinct layers until the ceiling is just a few feet wide. The stonework here is so precise that even today, you cannot slip a razor blade between the blocks. Some engineers believe the Grand Gallery was not merely a hallway, but a functional machine, a massive counterweight chute used to slide giant granite plugs down to seal the ascending passage after the pharaoh's funeral. At the very top of the Grand Gallery lies the King's Chamber, the final resting place of Khufu. Here, the limestone gives way entirely to the cold, dark, monolithic, red granite of Aswan. The engineering problem here was terrifying. The King's Chamber has a flat ceiling composed of 9 massive granite beams, weighing up to 70 tons each. Above this flat ceiling pressed the weight of hundreds of thousands of tons of stone. To prevent the ceiling from instantly cracking and crushing the pharaoh's mummy, the architects engineered a system of relieving chambers. Above the King's Chamber, they built 5 hidden, shallow compartments, stacked on top of one another. The ceilings of these compartments were left rough, but the final highest chamber was capped with a gabled roof, massive stones leaning against each other in an inverted V. This gabled roof acted as a shield, deflecting the unimaginable downward pressure of the pyramid outward, away from the flat ceiling of the King's Chamber, saving the room from collapse. And from the King's Chamber, 2 more of the mysterious 8-inch shafts extend outward. Unlike the shafts in the Queen's Chamber, these actually breach the exterior of the pyramid. For decades, they were assumed to be for ventilation, a way to give the workers air. But modern astronomy revealed a more profound purpose. The shafts are not random. They are precisely angled. The southern shaft points directly to the star Sirius, associated with the goddess Isis. The northern shaft points precisely to Thuban, which was the North Star during the time of the pyramid's construction. These were not air shafts. They were spiritual launch pads designed to provide a direct, unobstructed line of sight for Khufu's soul to shoot outward into the cosmos and take his rightful place among the undying stars. To construct this masterpiece in a time frame of 20 years, the estimated length of Khufu's reign requires math that is almost frightening to contemplate. To place 2.3 million blocks in 20 years means that, assuming they worked 12-hour days, 365 days a year, the Egyptian builders had to perfectly set 1 massive stone block every 2.5 minutes. The Great Pyramid is a testament not just to engineering, but to absolute, unquestioned national focus. But this obsession with monumentality came at a heavy cost. The wealth, the labor, and the timber required by Sneferu and Khufu slowly drained the vast reserves of the Old Kingdom. Khufu's son, Khafre, would build the second pyramid at Giza and the Great Sphinx, but it was slightly smaller, and by the time Khufu's grandson, Menkaure, built the third and final pyramid on the Giza plateau, the era of the giants was already ending. Menkaure's pyramid is less than half the size of his grandfather's. The Old Kingdom had reached for the stars and touched them, but the theological landscape was about to shift, and the age of the true pyramid would soon be buried in the sands of time. While Khufu's Great Pyramid remains the most famous, the Giza Plateau is defined by its trio of monuments. relentless. When Khufu's son, Khafre, took the throne around 2558 BCE, he faced an impossible architectural dilemma. How does a living god build a monument that asserts his own supreme divinity without directly insulting the legacy of his father? If he built smaller, he appeared weak. If he built larger, he risked the wrath of his father's spirit and the exhaustion of an already strained national treasury. Khafre's solution was a masterstroke of architectural optical illusion. He chose a spot on the Giza plateau just a few hundred yards south of his father's pyramid. Crucially, the bedrock at this specific location was naturally 33 feet higher than the bedrock beneath Khufu's pyramid. By building his pyramid on this elevated limestone foundation and by designing it with a slightly steeper angle of 53 degrees, Khafre achieved a brilliant visual deception. His pyramid was actually 10 feet shorter than the Great Pyramid, and its base was significantly smaller in total area. It required millions of tons less stone to construct, saving massive amounts of labor and resources. Yet, when viewed from the valley floor or the capital city of Memphis, Khafre's pyramid appeared to be the tallest of them all. Today, Khafre's pyramid is easily the most recognizable of the three because it is the only one that retains a significant portion of its original, smooth outer casing. At the very peak, like a snowy cap on a mountain, you can still see the polished white Tura limestone that once covered the entire structure. This surviving casing gives us a heartbreaking glimpse into how blindingly brilliant these monuments looked when they were newly finished, before thousands of years of earthquakes and medieval stone robbers stripped them bare. But Khafre's most enduring legacy is not his pyramid. It is the silent, colossal guardian that sits at the edge of his causeway, the Great Sphinx. To understand the Sphinx, we must again look at the logistics of the Giza Plateau. When Khufu's engineers were quarrying the millions of tons of core limestone for the Great Pyramid, they utilized the bedrock immediately surrounding the construction site. As they cut deeper and deeper into the plateau, they encountered a massive, U-shaped lump of rock that was deemed too poor in quality to be used for the pyramid's core blocks. The limestone in this specific outcrop was heavily stratified, consisting of alternating layers of hard rock and crumbling yellow sandstone. Instead of laboriously chipping this useless lump away, the quarrymen simply left it standing in the middle of the quarry pit. When Khafre began his building project, this massive, ugly lump of residual rock stood directly in the path of the processional causeway leading from his valley temple to his pyramid. Rather than route the causeway around it, Khafre's architects chose to transform the landscape. They ordered the royal sculptors to carve this leftover lump of bedrock in situ, right where it stood. The result was the Great Sphinx, a mythical creature possessing the body of a reclining lion and the head of a human, specifically wearing the Nemes headdress of a pharaoh. Measuring 240 feet long and 66 feet high, it is the largest monolithic statue in the world, carved from a single piece of stone. It was an act of supreme theological engineering. The lion was an ancient symbol of the sun and of royal dominance. By affixing his own face to the beast, Khafre was declaring himself not just the son of the sun god, but the physical embodiment of the sun god's fierce, protective power on earth. The Sphinx served as a colossal, eternal sentinel, guarding the Giza necropolis from spiritual and physical intruders. However, the very geology that made the Sphinx a leftover piece of rock is the same geology that threatens it today. Because the lower layers of the Sphinx's body are made of softer, highly porous limestone, it began to erode almost immediately after it was carved. The relentless desert wind, carrying abrasive sand, acted like sandpaper against the softer strata. For most of its history, the Sphinx has been buried up to its neck in sand, which actually protected it from destruction. It was only fully excavated in the modern era, revealing the massive paws and the small temple situated between them. The era of the giants concluded with the reign of Khafre's successor, Menkaure. Menkaure's pyramid, the third and final of the main Giza group, tells a story of changing priorities. It is less than half the height of the Great Pyramid, standing at just 213 feet. The volume of stone used is roughly 1/10 of what Khufu commanded. But what Menkaure lacked in sheer volume, he made up for in material expense. Instead of casing his pyramid entirely in local white limestone, Menkaure ordered the bottom 16 courses of his pyramid to be clad in the brutally hard pink granite imported from Aswan. This decision highlights a critical shift in the Egyptian economy. The massive, centralized workforce that built Khufu's pyramid was simply unsustainable over multiple generations. The The vast agricultural surpluses had been spent. The centralized power of the pharaoh was beginning to wane as local governors, known as nomarchs, began to hoard wealth and demand larger, more elaborate tombs for themselves in their home provinces. The state could no longer afford to build a 480-foot artificial mountain, so they compensated by using rarer, more difficult to transport materials to project their prestige. With Menkaure, the golden age of the Fourth Dynasty ended, and with it, the era of the colossal true pyramids. As Egypt moved into the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, the architectural focus shifted drastically. The absolute supremacy of the pharaoh was being eclipsed by the rising power of the priesthood, specifically the cult of the sun god Ra. The pyramids of the Fifth Dynasty, built at sites like Abu Sir, were structurally inferior to their Giza predecessors. Instead of solid limestone blocks, the core of these pyramids was often made of loose rubble, mud, and roughly hewn stones, held together by a retaining wall and encased in fine limestone. As long as the outer casing remained intact, they looked just like the masterpieces of Giza. But once the casing was removed by later generations, the loose cores simply collapsed into formless mounds of debris, which is how they appear today. Instead of pouring their resources into massive tombs, these later pharaohs spent their wealth building elaborate sun temples, open-air sanctuaries featuring massive obelisks designed to capture the first rays of the morning sun. The theology was changing. Immortality was no longer solely about the size of the stone mountain protecting the body. It was increasingly tied to the magical texts inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber, known as the pyramid texts, designed to guide the soul through the perilous underworld. And then, around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed entirely. A combination of factors brought the great pyramid builders to their knees. Climate change played a massive role. The annual flooding of the Nile, which had been so predictable for centuries, began to fail. A prolonged period of catastrophic drought swept across East Africa. Without the floodwaters, the crops failed. Without the crops, the vast agricultural surplus that funded the state vanished. Famine set in. Simultaneously, the central authority of the pharaoh completely shattered. The provincial governors, the nomarchs, stopped sending taxes to the capital in Memphis. They formed private armies and fought each other for control of the dwindling food supplies. Egypt entered a dark age known as the First Intermediate Period, a century of chaos, civil war, and starvation. During this breakdown of law and order, a grim realization dawned across Egypt. Pyramids were a terrible idea. A pyramid is, by definition, the most conspicuous structure possible. It is a 400-foot-tall billboard, visible for miles, announcing to the world, "Here lies a king, and he is buried with unimaginable amounts of gold, jewelry, and priceless artifacts." In the desperation of the famine, starving citizens and organized gangs of tomb robbers descended upon the necropolises. The intricate security measures designed by Imhotep and Khufu were entirely defeated. The massive granite plugs were bypassed by thieves who simply chiseled tunnels through the softer limestone around them. The false doors, the hidden corridors, the cursed inscriptions, none of it mattered. Every single pyramid of the Old Kingdom was systematically breached, looted, and desecrated. The mummies of the god kings were ripped apart in the frantic search for golden amulets wrapped in their bandages. When order was finally restored and Egypt was reunited under the Middle Kingdom around 2055 BCE, the new pharaohs had learned a bitter lesson. They still built pyramids, maintaining the ancient solar tradition, but the engineering was entirely different. They abandoned the massive stone blocks of Giza. The Middle Kingdom pyramids were constructed with a core of millions of cheap, sun-baked mud bricks, laid out in a grid pattern and filled with sand, then encased in a thin veneer of limestone. They were faster to build, required a fraction of the skilled labor, and placed less strain on the economy. More importantly, the Middle Kingdom architects completely reimagined the security of the burial chamber. They no longer relied on hiding the chamber deep within the stone core. Instead, they returned to carving the tombs deep underground, but with labyrinthine complexity. They built trapdoors, dead-end corridors, and false burial chambers containing empty sarcophagi to fool the robbers. The true burial chambers were carved out of single, massive blocks of quartzite, a stone even harder than granite, and the entrance shafts were designed to be filled with sand that would collapse and crush anyone trying to dig their way in. But even these brilliant countermeasures ultimately failed. Given enough time and enough greed, the tomb robbers always won. Every Middle Kingdom pyramid was eventually looted. By the time the New Kingdom dawned around 1550 BCE, inaugurating the era of famous pharaohs like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramesses the Great, the paradigm had completely shifted. The Egyptians realized that true security lay not in monumental visibility, but in absolute secrecy. The pyramid shape was entirely abandoned by the state. The pharaohs moved their royal necropolis hundreds of miles south to the arid, desolate mountains of Thebes. There, in a scorching, hidden canyon known as the Valley of the Kings, they ordered their tombs to be carved deep into the living rock of the cliff faces. There would be no grand superstructures, no gleaming limestone casings, no monuments announcing their presence. The entrances to these tombs were carefully buried under tons of rubble and swept smooth to look perfectly natural. The only pyramid they required was the natural pyramidal shape of the mountain peak known as Al-Qurn, which loomed over the valley, silently watching over the hidden dead. From the shallow pit graves of the desert sand, to the mud brick mastabas, to the towering geometric perfection of Giza, and finally to the hidden subterranean vaults of the Valley of the Kings. The evolution of the Egyptian tomb was a 3,000-year arms race between the human desire for eternal preservation and the relentless forces of nature and human greed. The Great Pyramid stands today not just as a marvel of engineering, but as the ultimate, impossible peak of an obsession that fundamentally shaped human history. Though the pharaohs abandoned the Giza plateau, the Great Pyramids did not simply vanish from human memory. As the centuries turned into millennia, they stood as silent, imposing monoliths, watching the rise and fall of entirely new empires. When the ancient Greeks arrived in Egypt around the 5th century BCE, the Great Pyramid was already over 2,000 years old. The historian Herodotus marveled at their scale, but he relied on the tales of local guides who were entirely disconnected from the original builders. It was Herodotus who first published the myth that Khufu was a tyrannical megalomaniac who enslaved 100,000 men to build his tomb. This narrative was incredibly powerful and persisted for over 2 millennia despite being entirely false. By the time the Roman Empire annexed Egypt, the pyramids had become ancient tourist attractions. Roman travelers carved their names into the stones of the Sphinx and marveled at the sheer antiquity of a civilization that made Rome look like an infant. But even the Romans did not fully understand the internal engineering of the monuments. The true test of the Great Pyramid's security came in the year 832 CE during the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun traveled from Baghdad to Egypt, fueled by legends that the Great Pyramid contained ancient maps of the stars, unbreakable glass, and unfathomable caches of gold. Al-Mamun could not find the original entrance, which had been expertly hidden beneath the smooth casing stones. So he ordered his men to force their way in. They used a brutally slow method of heating the limestone with massive fires, then dousing the hot stone with cold vinegar to cause it to crack. Slowly, agonizingly, they tunneled roughly 100 feet straight into the solid core of the pyramid. By pure, blind luck, their tunnel intercepted the original ascending passageway. To this day, Al-Mamun's hole is the entrance used by tourists to enter the Great Pyramid. When Al-Mamun and his men finally reached the king's chamber, anticipating the greatest treasure hoard in history, they found nothing. The massive granite sarcophagus was lidless and empty. The chamber was bare. The tomb robbers of antiquity had beaten him by roughly 3,000 years. For the next several centuries, the pyramids suffered their greatest physical devastation. In 1303 CE, a massive earthquake struck the region, severely loosening the fine white casing stones of the Great Pyramid. The medieval rulers of Cairo, needing building materials to repair their city and construct new mosques and fortresses, realized they had a quarry of perfectly pre-cut, polished limestone sitting just across the river. Over the next few decades, the Great Pyramid was systematically stripped of its brilliant white skin, exposing the rough, stepped core we see today. Khafre's pyramid only retained its casing at the very top, top because it was too dangerous and difficult for the medieval workers to dismantle it from such a height. The modern scientific understanding of the pyramids did not begin until 1798, when a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. Napoleon did not just bring an army of soldiers, he brought a massive corps of scientists, engineers, and artists known as the savants. Their mission was to thoroughly document the country. The savants conducted the first rigorous topographical surveys of the Giza plateau. They measured the dimensions of the pyramids with unprecedented accuracy and mapped the interior chambers. Their work, compiled in the monumental publication Description de l'Egypte, ignited a craze for ancient Egypt across Europe, birthing the modern science of Egyptology. In the 1880s, a British archaeologist named Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie arrived at Giza. At the time, eccentric theorists were claiming that the Great Pyramid was a divine instrument containing prophecies, built using a mystical measurement called the pyramid inch. Petrie, armed with highly precise surveying equipment, spent months living in a tomb on the plateau, meticulously measuring every accessible block of the Great Pyramid. His strict, unforgiving data proved that the pyramid was not a mystical prophecy machine, but a masterpiece of highly precise human engineering based on the standard Egyptian cubit. Petrie dragged the study of the pyramids out of the realm of mysticism and into the harsh, illuminating light of modern science. Even today, in the 21st century, the Great Pyramid continues to yield secrets. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project used a technique called muon radiography. Muons are cosmic ray particles that constantly rain down from space and pass through stone. By placing specialized detectors inside and around the pyramid, scientists could track how these particles were absorbed or deflected by the stone. The results were astonishing. The scans revealed a massive, previously unknown void located directly above the Grand Gallery, roughly 100 feet long. Is it another relieving chamber, a hidden gallery, or perhaps a secret room containing Khufu's true, undisturbed burial? As of right now, we do not know. It is completely inaccessible, sealed within millions of tons of limestone. The Great Pyramid, after 4,500 years, still refuses to surrender all of its mysteries. From the shifting sands of the early pit graves to the unyielding granite of the King's Chamber, the story of the pyramids is the story of humanity's absolute refusal to be forgotten. They built a mountain to cheat death, and in a way, they succeeded. Khufu's physical body may be lost to history, but his name and the monument he commissioned will endure until the earth itself ceases to exist. And now, if you are utilizing this video for the Dopamine Detox Challenge, it is time to check your focus. You have just absorbed thousands of years of history, engineering, and human evolution. Let us see how much your brain retained. I will ask 15 questions. After each question, there will be a brief pause for you to formulate your answer, followed by the correct response. Question 1. Before the invention of the mastaba, how were early Egyptians naturally mummified in the pre-dynastic period? A. By soaking the bodies in resin. B. By placing them in shallow pit graves dug into the dry desert sand. C. By wrapping them in hundreds of yards of linen. D. By sealing them in wooden coffins. The correct answer is B. They were placed in shallow pit graves dug into the desert sand, which naturally drew out the moisture. Question 2. What does the Arabic word mastaba translate to in English? A. Mountain. B. House of the dead. C. Bench. D. Stonebox. The correct answer is C. Mastaba translates to bench due to its flat-roofed, rectangular shape. Question 3. What was the name of the hidden room inside a mastaba that contained a life-sized statue of the deceased to act as a backup for the soul? A. The Serdab. B. The Bay Chamber. C. The False Door. D. The Necropolis. The correct answer is A. The Serdab. Question 4. Who was the vizier to Pharaoh Djoser, credited as the first named architect in history and the designer of the Step Pyramid? A. Khufu. B. Huni. C. Imhotep. D. Sneferu. The correct answer is C. Imhotep. Question 5. The Step Pyramid was built using limestone. Before this, what was the primary building material for Egyptian tombs? A. Baked clay pottery. B. Solid granite. C. Imported cedar wood. D. Sun-dried mud brick. The correct answer is D, sun-dried mud brick. Question 6. Pharaoh Sneferu's first attempt at a smooth-sided pyramid ended in a catastrophic collapse. Where was this pyramid located? A. Meidum, B. Giza, C. Dashur, D. Saqqara. The correct answer is A. Meidum. Question 7. To prevent the burial chamber inside the bent pyramid from collapsing under the weight of the stone, what architectural technique did Sneferu's engineers invent? A. The load-bearing arch, B. The corbelled vault, C. The central pillar system, D. The flying buttress. The correct answer is B, the corbelled vault. Question 8. How did Khufu's engineers achieve a perfectly leveled foundation across the 13-acre base of the Great Pyramid? A. By dragging massive stone rollers across the sand. B. By using a primitive magnetic compass. C. By carving trenches into the bedrock and using the natural level of water. D. By relying entirely on visual estimation. The correct answer is C, by carving trenches into the bedrock and using the natural level of water from the Nile. Question 9. The Great Pyramid is famously composed of roughly 2.3 million stone blocks. While the core is local limestone, where was the incredibly hard red granite for the king's chamber sourced? A. The Tura quarries. B. Aswan, 500 miles to the south. C. The Sinai Peninsula. D. Imported from modern-day Lebanon. The correct answer is B, Aswan, 500 miles to the south. Question 10. How did the builders reduce the friction of the heavy wooden sledges dragging the stone blocks across the desert sand? A. By laying down wooden tracks. B. By greasing the sleds with animal fat. C. By dragging them over crushed gravel. D. By pouring precisely measured amounts of water on the sand in front of the runners. The correct answer is D, by pouring precisely measured amounts of water on the sand in front of the runners. Question 11. The two mysterious 8-inch shafts extending from the king's chamber were originally thought to be for ventilation. What is now believed to be their actual purpose? A. To act as speaking tubes for the priests. B. To drain water in the event of a flood. C. To serve as a spiritual launch pad aligned with specific stars. D. To drop offerings down to the burial chamber. The correct answer is C, to serve as a spiritual launch pad aligned with specific stars. Question 12. How did Pharaoh Khafre make his pyramid appear taller than Khufu's Great Pyramid, despite actually being 10 feet shorter? A. He built it on a section of bedrock that was 33 feet higher. B. He made the base significantly narrower. C. He capped it with a massive golden pyramidion. D. He painted the entire structure white to create an optical illusion. The correct answer is A. He built it on a section of bedrock that was 33 feet higher. Question 13. The Great Sphinx is the largest monolithic statue in the world. Why was it carved in that specific location? A. It marks the exact geographic center of ancient Egypt. B. It was carved from a massive, leftover lump of poor quality bedrock left by the quarrymen. C. It was designed to block a natural spring from flooding the plateau. D. It was built over the original burial site of Khufu. The correct answer is B. It was carved from a massive, leftover lump of poor quality bedrock left by the quarrymen. Question 14. What combination of events caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom and brought the Great Pyramid building era to an end? A. An invasion by the Roman Empire. B. A catastrophic earthquake and a volcanic eruption. C. Climate change causing drought, famine, and the rebellion of provincial governors. D. A massive worker strike at the Giza plateau. The correct answer is C. Climate change causing drought, famine, and the rebellion of provincial governors. Question 15. In the New Kingdom, realizing that pyramids were just massive targets for tomb robbers, where did pharaohs choose to hide their royal tombs? A. Beneath the Sphinx. B. In subterranean tombs carved into the cliff faces of the Valley of the Kings. C. Inside the old step pyramids of Saqqara. D. At the bottom of the Nile River. The correct answer is B. In subterranean tombs carved into the cliff faces of the Valley of the Kings. How did you do? If you remembered the correct options for the majority of these details, your focus is sharp and your attention span is recovering. If you struggled, do not be discouraged. Rewiring an overstimulated brain takes time. The most important step is simply putting the phone down and choosing to engage deeply with one subject. Thank you for taking the time to challenge yourself today. Subscribe to the channel, return in 3 days for your next deep dive, and continue taking your brain back.